Now that we understand how to store and use passwords within our server to authenticate inbound requests, how should our clients use those passwords within their systems? Right now, each time a user makes a request, they would have to provide their password. And this would get cumbersome for our users. We don't want them to have to enter their password with every request that they make. Instead, we prefer the client to actually keep track of this record so that every request can automatically keep some form of authentication token along with it while that request is being made. One way of doing this is by creating a session ID and a cookie. Cookies are sort of an older school concept that have been replaced by some more modern concepts in front end, which we'll talk about soon, but it's worth mentioning. In almost all of the patterns that we'll use that store some kind of credential in the client, we're not saving the password locally within that client. Instead, the password is used once to hit some kind of endpoint to log in the user, and we're providing some information back to the user. The session ID pattern provides an ID that allows that user to continue to interact with that session. That session ID links some concept of a session or an instance in time where the user is allowed to perform actions. That ID is unique and only given to one user. That user now will store that as a cookie within the browser, which is basically just a value stored that can be accessed locally, and then provide that session ID with each subsequent request. Whenever that session ID is retrieved by the server, it will check with the database to make sure it's still valid, and then, if yes, provide access to a resource if authorized. A more modern spin is to use something called a JSON Web Token, or JWT. Now, after that first login request, the server responds with a JWT, or this large blob of data that contains some information that the server can make sense of. We'll unpack what this is in just a second, but essentially, we store this locally within the client. In most cases, we'll store this in the local data store, or IndexedDB, basically just a place in the web browser where we can store information. And we'll provide this as part of an authorization header in our request. If you think way back to the request response cycle, we were talking about a concept called headers. Well, we finally got to one that's super important. With every subsequent request, we'll provide an authorization header, the word bearer, and then the data that is included in that JWT.